Welcome back to the channel. I'm Kevin, and today I'm going to be making the Nightkiller Dagger from specifically the solo leveling anime. There are a number of versions of this dagger out there, including one I made myself a few years ago based on the webtoon, but I couldn't find a single one that perfectly matched the updated design we see in the anime. So today, I'm going to fix that. Also, if we're being really honest, there's another reason I wanted to revisit this project. A couple of months ago, I remade Baruka's dagger and was shocked at how much better it looked. It's amazing what a much nicer printer and a few more years of experience can accomplish. I'm all fired up from watching the end of Season 2, and this seemed like a cool project to come back to. I went through the anime and found some nice reference images to work off of. As I was studying this, I realized the design changed a lot more than I realized. The hilt is still gold, but it used to come to a much sharper point in the webtoon. The blade is generally beefier, which I really like. And the details on the blade, especially near the tip, are a little bit different than they were before. The other versions of the dagger you find online, including my own make from a few years ago, are still recognizable and probably good enough for a cosplay. But today, I'm going to try to replicate what we see in the anime as faithfully as possible. I started by editing together some images into a good reference and tracing over all the key parts. Then I went into Blender and started tracing over my design with a plane. I extruded the plane twice and then started creasing the edges. This is a key step if you plan to use a subdivision surface modifier. This is the biggest trick I've found to making nice looking stuff in Blender without having a ton of experience. The subdivision surface modifier will round over everything unless you crease the edges, so you just have to make a rough, blocky version of the final result and let Blender do the heavy lifting. This does take some practice, but it's a great tool for hobbyists. I mirrored that extruded plane, and then spent some time cleaning up all the little mistakes I made, which weren't immediately obvious. I worked my way down the dagger and started on the hilt. I took a few liberties here, and spent a lot more time than I was expecting tweaking this. Moving on to the handle, I decided to approach this a little bit differently than the last time I made this dagger. When Jinwoo first gets this, right before his big fight with Iris, he wraps the handle in cloth bandages, which I really like the look of and decided to do when I made it the first time. I quite like mixing 3D printing with other materials, because I find it makes the object a little more interesting. But this time around, I decided to go with something that was totally 3D printed. I carefully adjusted the points on a cylinder to make it look like this was wrapped. Then I scaled down some of these sections to create clear divisions between the different wrapped pieces, which was when I realized I had some unintended internal geometry. I wanted the thickness of the handle to vary a bit, which was hard given how I set this up. This led to a lot of tweaking before I smoothed everything over with yet another subdivision surface modifier. I made the point on the pommel by following the exact same steps I used to create the larger blade. At this point, I realized I nearly made a big mistake. When I was creating my reference, I drew the point on the pommel facing down, but it really should be facing up. This was an easy fix because I just rotated it around, but I would have been annoyed if I'd missed that. One of the last details was the channels running along the base of the blade. I created some cubes to roughly outline this, and then used, you guessed it, a subdivision surface modifier to smooth these out. Then I used a Boolean difference modifier to cut these into the blade. I tried to divide this up nicely for printing, but it had so many modifiers in here that Blender was giving me trouble. Exporting was really time consuming in this case because I was trying to do something very specific, which I'll talk about later on in the video. I did eventually get it to work, it just took me 3 hours of fiddling with it. I printed this on my Bamboo P1P, using some PLA. The pieces all looked pretty great right out of the printer. I carefully peeled the supports to not break any of the sharp points. I wasn't very successful with this, but I'll talk more about that at the end. I connected the pieces using some small biscuits I printed, which worked really well. Lining up pieces for gluing can be a major challenge. What I did last time I made these daggers was add 2mm holes between the pieces, so I could insert a short length of finishing nail to line everything up, which was a crude but generally effective approach. Over the past several months, I've been trying to shift to using interlocking pieces or biscuits, which I've had varying degrees of success with. The turning point was a few months ago, when I made the large Stardust staff from Final Fantasy, where really no part of it went together the way I imagined. That lit a fire under me to do better, and this dagger is really my test piece for how to better assemble things in future. With the blade pieces together, I sanded them with my Dremel tool. Then I applied some wood filler, sanded it off, and repeated the process. I primed all of the pieces, and they were ready for painting. Normally, I divide my finished models up into nice printable sections, with no real regard for the individual pieces, and then I glue everything together and prime it before I start painting. This time around, I divided this into discrete pieces, separating things like the blade from the hilt, so that I can paint these pieces separately and then assemble it all nicely at the end. This does make modeling a little bit more difficult, and it takes much more time to export, but the idea is that it makes finishing and assembly so much easier. I started by painting the gold sections, which would need a few coats of paint to get good coverage. I started with a matte base coat to speed this process up, which was something I missed on last month's Amulet of Vigor and really regretted. Then I applied folk art metallic paint, and the results were immediately pretty good. Much better than if I had just painted this over the base gray. I did the same thing with the red and black on the blade, starting with matte colors before applying the final coats. The gold sections used pure folk art metallic paint, but for the blade and handle, I used a mix of matte and metallic acrylic paint to give it just a little bit of a shine. I started with the red on the blade, and then went through with the black to really define the details. I also painted the handle, which was just a dark gray and probably the easiest part of the dagger. Now it was time to assemble everything, which is when my efforts really started to pay off. I put in the pegs, applied the glue, and slotted everything together, which was tremendously satisfying. Working with complicated daggers like this can be annoying, but it also gives you plenty of places to hook on rubber bands to hold everything together while the glue dries. The final detail were these little gold caps, which were so small and fit beautifully. After letting the glue dry, I sprayed this with some clear matte sealer to finish it off. Before I go any farther, I do have to ask, if you've made it this far, I hope you'll like the video and subscribe to the channel if you haven't already. It does a lot to help me out, and it lets the YouTube algorithm know that this is worth watching. Without further ado, here are the final results. Overall, I am really happy with this. It turned out well, but there were some areas where I could still improve. One issue was the details on the tip. In the montage, I focused on this side, because I got the detail flipped around on the other one. I did have my reference image open while I was working on this, but I had to mirror this in my head and got it all flipped around. Next time, I'm going to open the reference in GIMP and mirror it, which would take maybe 10 seconds, so I can avoid any silly mistakes like this. I also broke off a lot of the points while I was finishing this, which isn't a big deal for pictures or anything from afar, but does really annoy me. If you're making your own, I recommend paying special attention to these areas to make sure you don't do any damage. The big win here was how everything went together. The assembly was smoother than any of my other projects. It did take a lot of time and effort, but I learned a ton. And since this is an area I haven't really focused on in the past, it was really satisfying to see myself making clear progress. If you want to make your own, I'll post all the files online. Just check the video description down below for a link. I'll also have Amazon affiliate links to all the products I used in this video in case you want to support the channel that way. I'll be back next month with another project, so until then.